Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergy tier list video. Today our analyst will be ranking each Synergy from S down to D tier. Keep in mind the meta may shift throughout the patch, and that can certainly cause some traits to go up in value and others to go down. With that said, let's get right into the video. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. One more thing before we get back into the video is that a B patch recently came out for 10.8 that may affect where Darkstar and Star Guardian are on the tier list. Darkstar received nerfs to the 4-piece and 6-piece damage bonus, and Shaco had the damage increase on his ultimate nerfed at all 3 star levels. Because of that, it may cause Darkstar to fall down in power for the rest of 10.8, though both Jhin and Xerath are still strong carries. Syndra was the only champion nerfed in the B patch for Star Guardian, and while it isn't that large of an increase as it's going from 50 to 65, it still reduces how quickly and often she will cast her ultimate. This mostly just means Seraph is an even more important item for her now, but the general composition should still be strong. Let's get back to the video, and to start it off, we have the S tier. This consists of Darkstar, Sorcerer, and Star Guardian. Synergies in the S tier are at the top of the meta and are great at getting top 3 placements consistently. First up in the S tier, we have Darkstar. Darkstar has really moved up in the listings in 10.8 with the addition of Xerath mixed in with the previous rework of Darkstar in 10.7 have culminated into a meta where this trait does extremely well. With Xerath as the 7th Darkstar champion, there's now 3 viable carries, with Shaco and Jhin being the other 2. Shaco is still dominating in compositions using Darkstar, and Infiltrator as his damage output is insanely high. Jhin isn't as reliable of a carry, but with the proper items can still do well, and a 2-star Xerath can do a ton of work, especially against the popular compositions like Star Guardian Sorcerer. The current drawback of Darkstar is actually the popularity of the build, as you're likely going to see it being played by several other people each game, which can make it more difficult to do well. That said, it's one of the few traits that can support multiple people playing it, so while it may be harder to get Shaco 3, for example, you can still do well with the trait by going Shaco 2 carry or Jhin carry. Next up in the S tier, we have Sorcerers. Sorcerers are doing extremely well right now, as they have a place in several meta compositions, with the best being Star Guardian Sorcerer. Outside of that, you're often going to see 2 Sorcerers splashed into other builds such as Darkstar and Mech-Infiltrator. Overall, with the way the meta has shifted, there's almost always a way to splash into Sorcerers for a good portion of the compositions you're likely going to want to play. Syndra is one of the better carries for this trait, though Vel'Koz and Xerath are both viable options. Lux is also one of the most versatile champions right now, as she's put into several compositions because of her traits, on top of having an ultimate with good CC. Annie is still a must-have for any build using Mech-Pilot, and Ahri plus Zoe are needed for any Star Guardian Sorcerer composition. All in all, not only is the trait useful, the champions themselves are all pivotal to various builds in the meta. The last trait of the S tier is Star Guardian. This is likely not a surprise considering the trait goes hand in hand with Sorcerer. That is the main drawback of this trait, as it's heavily reliant on the meta favoring Sorcerers, but for the time it's near the top of the meta. Your goal with Star Guardians is simply to get to level 7, find all the pieces plus 1 extra Sorcerer, and roll excess gold to find Syndra and Nico 3. It's a straightforward playstyle that makes sense for an easy climb in ranked. It is a bit item dependent, though you're not likely to try to run the build without having a few tier items for Syndra or Guardian Angel for Nico. Another issue is the trait doesn't support multiple people playing it, so it's important to scout to see if anyone else is contesting it. But even with those 2 issues, playing the Synergy, especially when paired with Sorcerer, is a great way to earn consistent top 3 placements. Now we can move on to the A tier Synergies. These Synergies are Cybernetic, Mech-Pilot, Infiltrator, Chrono, Brawler, Blaster, and Celestial. A tier is for the traits that are doing well in the meta and commonly played in top 4 compositions. To kick off the A tier, we have Cybernetic. Cybernetics are still going strong in 10.8 despite being nerfed, and while they aren't as dominant as they were in the previous meta, they are still a popular and effective trait for the current meta. They are one of the least item dependent traits, as it doesn't necessarily matter what item one of the units has, since it'll get the health and damage bonus for the trait regardless. Aurelia is still doing well as a late game carry, and Lucian is one of the stronger mid game carries. Speaking of Lucian, he's an important champion to talk about, as him plus other early cybernetics make for one of the best routes you can take early game to net yourself a win streak. With player damage changes, it's much more difficult to go on losing streaks since you're going to lose a lot of health, so win streaking is what you should be aiming for, and cybernetics can do that for you. Definitely look to play this trait early and mid game, even if your end game composition doesn't doesn't end up using them. Moving right along, we have Mech-Pilot as the next synergy in the A tier. Mech-Pilot did receive a couple of balance changes in 10.8, which made the late game Super Mech a bit weaker. This change is the main factor that this trait is not in the S tier, as it no longer guarantees you a win when playing the popular build Mech-Infiltrator. But it is still doing well, and getting Annie 3 with Rumble 3 is a great way to get a top 4 placement. Well, we can't talk about Mech-Pilot with also talking about Infiltrator, right? Infiltrator is still a key trait for the Mech-Infiltrator composition, and while the trait itself isn't that necessary outside of the build, the fact that Shaco is such a strong champion helps this trait quite a bit. Kaisa is also a fantastic carry, and while Fizz and Kha'Zix are on the lackluster side, there's still Echo to hold down the fort in the late game. Basically, the champions for this trait are both strong and versatile, and the prominence of Mech-Infiltrator makes this a top tier trait in the meta. Coming up next for A tier is Chrono. Chrono is in an interesting position, as it's commonly splashed into a lot of builds, but generally isn't the focal point of any build. It's useful on several different carries, the most notable being Kale, and has great champions like Thresh and Shen. Overall, this trait is in the A tier due to how common it is in the current meta, even though by itself it's not that dominant of a trait. Moving on down the list, we have Brawler up next. The synergy is still one of the best frontline options in set 3, and while builds utilizing it aren't that dominant, the champions themselves are quite popular. Vi, Blitzcrank, and Cho'Gath are all versatile in the current meta, and Malphite is an extremely useful early game champion. You can't go wrong throwing in a couple of Brawlers into quite a few builds if you want both useful champions and a decent frontline. Nearing the end of A tier, we have a companion trait to Brawlers, Blaster. Blaster has several great champions that you see at various stages of the game in different builds, but the main build that uses Blasters is still a bit hit or miss in the meta. Because of that, this trait is on the lower end of A tier, but don't let that dissuade you from picking up champions like Lucian, Graves, or Misfortune. Jinx can be an unreliable carry, but is still the primary carry for Brawler Blaster, and while Ezreal hasn't fully recovered since he was nerfed, he's still a Chrono champion, which makes him easily put into several builds. And the last synergy for A tier is Celestial. Celestial is similar to Chrono in that it's a common splash trait more than anything else. You're also likely to mainly only see 2 Celestial, as 4 and 6 are rarely played, but the 2-piece trait is still useful due to the champions. Notably, the best champion is Lulu by far for Celestial, and she's such a great key late game champion, which is why Celestial is so common to add in. Kassadin has been doing work lately in the meta, and Ashe is often played in Darkstar builds. Let's move on down to the B tier. This tier consists of Valkyrie, Demolitionist, Blademaster, Mana Reaver, Sniper, Mystic, and Mercenary. B tier is mainly support traits that are good, just situational. Starting off the B tier, we have Valkyrie. Valkyrie has 3 fantastic champions, with Kale, Kaisa, and Misfortune all being important in different compositions. Because this trait is only 3 champions, you're going to see it in a limited set of circumstances, which is why it's in the B tier. That said, it's a great damage boost for all 3 of the units and is a necessity in compositions that utilize those champions. Up next is a more niche trait in the current meta, Demolitionist. This essentially is a trait to help Kaisa in the Super Mech and Mech-Infiltrator. Demolitionist charge is a core item on Kaisa, and outside of that situation and build, you're unlikely to see it played. That said, it's still extremely important for the Mech-Infiltrator, which makes it a must-have trait when playing the build. Continuing down the list, we have Blademaster. Blademaster is still in a weird spot because it's a really important support trait for certain carry champions like Kale, Master Yi, and Aurelia, but it's never the star of any composition. It's more or less played just because the champions that are played in those builds also just happen to be Blademaster. It's useful to be sure, but it's strictly a support synergy more than anything else. Alright, let's move on to the next synergy, Mana Reaver. This trait has been way more useful since the rework to it, and it's played in several builds that use either Aurelia or Thresh. But that's also the downside, as it's often only played because of Aurelia or Thresh. However limiting it can be to play, it's still a great trait in the right situation. Another synergy that's limited by the amount of champions it has is Sniper. Because there's only 3 champions with the trait, it can definitely be difficult to play often. But it is a key trait for Jhin and Darkstar, so while it's limited in its use, it's still a potent trait in the right situation, much like Mana Reaver. The second to last synergy in B tier is Mystic. It may feel like Mystic should be higher on the list, but it really is relegated to a 2-piece support trait at the moment. It's unlikely to see most compositions be able to fit in for Mystic. That said, 2 Mystic is quite common in compositions at level 8 or 9, so this trait is still quite valuable, especially in a magic damage meta. For the last synergy in B tier, we have Mercenary. It's definitely possible this trait could be lower, but it's saved save because of how pivotal it is for late game misfortune. Without the upgrade, she definitely would not be as much of a late game carry, and that's what really pushes this trait up the list, even though Gangplank is struggling right now in the current meta. Alright, let's move on to the C tier. This tier consists of Vanguard, Protector, Space Pirate, Rebel, and Void. C tier is for the synergies that can be good at certain stages of the game or in special circumstances. Up first is Vanguard. Vanguard does really well early game and is essential for a strong frontline, but as the meta is quite magic damage focused, the trait falls off quite a bit come mid and late game. Even the physical damage carries do enough damage that they really don't care about the Vanguard armor. All in all, the trait is definitely useful early game, but in the current meta, it's not having much use in the later stages of the game. Protector is next on the list as it's a trait that can do quite well. In fact, it can actually carry a game and get you to a top 3 placement. It's just not consistent enough. It's definitely fallen off from its previously lofty positions in the meta, but if you're able to snag a Xinjiao 3 and a Rakan 3, you can sometimes still do well. Let's talk about an early game focused trait, Space Pirates. Space Pirates are fantastic early game because of the extra gold that they net you, but they still suffer greatly later in the game as it's just not reliable to use them in most compositions. That said, it's still one of the better early game traits if you manage to find a Darius 2 or a Jace 2. Next up, we have Rebel. Rebels are still suffering in the current meta. There's a few outliers here or there where they'll do well, but ultimately they've been relegated to an early game trait, mostly due to how good Malphite 2 is at that stage of the game. We do acknowledge the build that uses Master Yi and Yasuo as carries, but that really doesn't have much to do with the Rebel trait, and the build itself is also fairly inconsistent. And the last synergy in the C tier is Void. Void has fallen off quite hard in 10.8 because of the build that used it. Void Brawler has become rare and inconsistent. It can still do well if you find a Vel'Koz 3, but it's not as prominent in the meta as it was in 10.7. That said, both Cho'Gath and Vel'Koz are good champions and played in different compositions, but having 3 Void is a bit rare right now in the meta. Alright, we're moving on to our last tier, the D tier. This tier consists of only one trait, Starship. Unfortunately, Aurelion Sol is still flying around as one of the weaker legendary champions despite receiving a few buffs in 10.8. Hopefully he's able to soar back up the list in the next patch. Alright folks, that is it for today's tier list video. While tier lists are useful, it's best to keep in mind that they fluctuate a lot over time due to shifts in the meta. Let us know in the comment sections below what synergies you think should be higher or lower on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future GiantSlayerTV videos.